everyone, welcome back for part 2 of ethnicity. Today we're looking at boundaries. And your objective today is to be able to describe the different shapes of states and the kinds of boundaries. Tidbit of the day is this border between Brazil and Bolivia. So Bolivia has deforestation laws and Brazil does not. We see a very clear difference between the two countries as we look here. All right, so starting out with boundaries. There are a bunch of different types, but we're going to focus right here on 3 major ones. So the first one is physical boundaries. These are also known as natural boundaries, and they match the physical landscape. They're some type of geographic feature that is part of the physical landscape. So it could be things like deserts because they're really hard to cross. And that's what it says under here is cross. Mountains are another major physical boundary. They're difficult to cross, especially during the winter. Mountains are much colder, generally speaking, than the vicinity around them. So it's going to be really hard to cross when they're snowy and slippery and extremely, extremely cold. Problem is, where do we draw the line? It's very difficult to just say, okay, well, let's draw it down the middle, or to draw it around the mountain, because then everybody's going to want the resources. And down the center isn't necessarily that easy. So it's pretty difficult to kind of determine where we draw that line. Water is another physical boundary. So things like rivers, lakes, oceans, and these are really great because they're very obvious. They provide transportation for trade or military. They also provide protection. So you can defend them with a navy. They are make it very difficult for a bunch of people to cross. You can see for a long distance over them, so if someone is trying to attack you, you can see them and defend against them early on. So I want you in your notebook to come up with examples for each type of physical boundary. And when I say this, I want specifics. Don't tell me water, tell me a body of water. Don't tell me mountains, tell me a mountain range. Come up with that, where we're actually using these especially as a physical boundary, where we see the edge of a state or a region with that boundary. So include the name of the physical features and the states that they separate. So one for each. Come up with the name and who does it separate. Put this in your notes. This is important. I want you to know these things. All right, our second type of boundary are cultural boundaries. We see a few different ones in here. Geometric also kind of comes into this one. And sometimes we look at it as a different type, but realistically it's still a cultural boundary because it's limiting something that's happening there. So this is a boundary drawn without thought to culture, population, or physical features. When we see straight lines on maps, these are geometric boundaries. So think geometry, we deal with shapes, very straight lines or very precise lines. Same thing here. So if we look at the boundary between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, we see almost entirely an extremely straight line. Got it right down the middle. This is also an artificial boundary. This does not exist in nature. This exists on paper. This exists in practice. It exists because someone put it there. In cultural boundaries, we also will see antecedent and subsequent boundaries. So ante, A-N-T-E, means before, not anti, which means against, but ante means before. So this is a boundary that existed before people, before an area was populated. Think things like our mountains, our rivers, our deserts. Those are antecedent boundaries. They existed because nature put them there way before people ever put them there. But they also help to separate cultures, to keep them isolated from each other. A subsequent boundary is drawn after the area is populated, and it's basically drawn because the area is populated. So it reflects that population. But subsequent, sub meaning after or below. We're also going to see something called a relic boundary. This should have a T on the end of it. But a relic boundary is a former boundary line that is no longer relevant, but it's still obvious. It's left over from olden times. So for example, the Great Wall of China. We could also refer to parts of the Berlin Wall. We can still see pieces of things. Parts of them still exist, but it's no longer used as a boundary. Okay, so come up with examples for each type of cultural boundary and include the names of the states in which those cultural boundaries exist, or if they separate cultures. All right, so getting into the shapes of states. The way that a state is shaped, and remember, sometimes we're talking about states like in the United States, sometimes we're talking about states like countries. It's incredibly important. So when we have whatever that shape is, that's going to affect the length of a boundary and therefore its relationship with its neighbors. So we have a very long boundary with Mexico. That affects our relationship. We have a very long and even longer boundary with Canada. That's going to affect our relationship there as well. So it should theoretically mean that we have good relationships with both of those countries, because sharing this big long boundary otherwise is going to be kind of tough. So we have a few different types of state shapes. The first one is compact, and this essentially means that it's a ball. As a relative term, because obviously nothing's going to be shaped quite exactly like a circle or a ball here, but it's roughly equidistant from the center to the edges. So if we look here at Kenya and we put a dot right in the middle, it's fairly equidistant all the way around. There's nothing really crazy one way or really narrow one way. Pretty compact. This is really great for small states. So it allows for easy communication, allows for a lot of organization. They don't have to stretch out to reach anyone. They don't have to reach other parts of the country that might not be attached. It's really nice. The next one is elongated states. And I want you to take a moment to think about why these might be problematic. So Chile is a really great example of an elongated state. And I want you to think, we're looking at the capital, Santiago, right here in the middle. What's the problem when it has to get to something like Punta Arenas or up to Antofagasta? So think about the issues that might happen there. But this is a state with a long and narrow shape. As the name suggests, it's elongated. It is really bad for internal communication because the edges tend to get isolated. Especially if we think about where our capital is. If it's in the middle, it's still difficult to get to either end. If it's on one end or closer to one end, then it's going to be really, really far to get anywhere else. So it's difficult for communication and potentially for governing. A prorupted state is a state with a large projecting extension. I like to think of this as like an erupted state. So if we think about what a volcanic eruption looks like and it sends out these big, long extensions, that's what I think of here. This is called the proruption. So Thailand is a prorupted state. You have this part here that's fairly compact, but then this big long extension. So why in the world would Thailand want this big long extension here? And look at the stuff that's around it to think about that. Usually this is for access to a resource. It might be to separate other states. They don't necessarily want someone else to have access to resources, or they don't want other places to be next to each other. But if we think about this one here, look, it is surrounded by water. This is the vacation spot. This is the touristy spot of Thailand, and tons and tons and tons of people go here for vacations, to visit, all kinds of good stuff. It makes Thailand a lot of money. This is where a lot of their income comes from. And that's really important. It also gives them access to all of the other resources that are around, so things like fish and oil and whatever else is coming from the ocean. A perforated state. If I take a piece of paper and I punch a hole in it, that piece of paper is now perforated. So this is a state that completely surrounds another state. Basically, it's a state that has a hole in it. For example, South Africa. Right in the middle of South Africa, we have another state called Lesotho. Now I want you to think about, why would this be problematic? And realistically, we're going to see it being problematic potentially for both sides. So one problem is that it causes access issues for the surrounded state. So that surrounded state, to do anything, they would essentially have to have permission from the perforated state. So this is the perforatee. That's going to be really difficult. They can't have anything shipped by ground in directly because they have to go through this other country. If South Africa has beef with Lesotho, then that's really going to cause some problems for Lesotho, because now they can choke off any stuff. They can absolutely be interfered with by that surrounding state. So say that South Africa decides that they want to take this over, fairly easy for them to surround it militarily, or just in general to cause problems. All right, a fragmented state. So think about when you drop a piece of glass and it shatters, and then you have fragments all over the place. This is when a country has a piece of it in another place. It's not connected to it. So for example, we have Russia with Kaliningrad over here. This is still part of Russia. It is separate from the entire rest of the country by actually several states in between. Indonesia is another fragmented state. So we have little pieces of Indonesia all over the place. So what are some pros and cons? I want you to take a moment, write this out in your notebook, think about this. What's some good stuff, what's some bad stuff? Because we do have both sides. The United States is also another country that we could consider fragmented because we have Alaska and Hawaii. And that's important to remember, especially if you've ever been to Alaska and Hawaii. What's good about it? What's negative about it? Thinking about it being part of the US. So these are states that are disconnected from the major part of the country. So we have disconnected territories. This says a lot. It doesn't actually have to be a lot. It could be one. Like Kaliningrad. It is separated by land or water. Some issues with it is that it can be very difficult to travel. It can be difficult to maintain nationalism, that concept of like pride in one's country, and it can be difficult to communicate within the state. So when we need to communicate with Alaska, when we want to travel to Alaska, it's really far. Same thing with Hawaii. So a lot of times they can feel very, very disconnected, and yeah, part of the US, but also very dissimilar to parts of to the rest of the US in a lot of ways. Can also be separated by another state. And again, we're still getting that same issue, the difficulty to communicate, to travel, to maintain nationalism. For probably a lot of the people who live in Kaliningrad, they're going to have a lot more in common with the people who live in Poland and Lithuania rather than the people who live in Russia, even though they themselves are technically Russian. All right, a landlocked state. Think about what this says. It is locked in the land, meaning it doesn't have access to water. Doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have rivers or anything, but it does not touch the ocean or the sea or some greater body of water that's going to allow it access out into the rest of the world. Think about why this would be a problem. So it lacks direct access to the ocean, and this causes a lot of issues with transportation and with access. Again, think about like Lesotho. So they cannot directly access the ocean, so that means they're very limited in things that they can ship out or things that they can bring in. If people want to travel, they have to travel through South Africa unless they're on a plane, which is still going to have its own issues with it. But they're not getting that direct access, to the ocean. All right, looking at enclaves and exclaves. So think of on as in and ex as outside of. So an enclave, and this is kind of a confusing concept because a country or a place can be both. An enclave is a bit of land within a state that it doesn't belong to. This is a slightly weird wording, but it's inside of a state that it doesn't belong to. An exclave is a portion of a state that is separated from the rest of its country, its state, and surrounded by another country. These are two sides of the same thing. When we're talking about it being within another country, it's an enclave. When we're talking about it being outside of a country, it's an exclave. Okay, so to clear this up a little bit. So we have country A, this is our foreign country. We have country B, this is our mother country. And then we have part C. We'll ignore this one for now. But on this side, part C is an exclave of country B. But within country A, it's an enclave. Hopefully that makes it a little bit more clear. So it's an exclave of country B, but it's an enclave of country A, or within country A. On this side, it changes a little bit. So an enclave has to be entirely surrounded by a single country. So we get the same thing, except for now we add in another place. So here, C is another foreign country, and D is part of the mother state. So D is the mother state's exclave. It's entirely outside of this country. But it's not an enclave, because it's touched by both of these foreign countries. It is not entirely within one or the other. So looking here, we are in the Netherlands. So remember, the Netherlands are Dutch. Everything in red is a Belgian enclave within the Netherlands. So we have parts of Belgium, this is legally Belgium, that is within the Netherlands. But gets a little meta here. Within those Belgian enclaves, we now have Dutch enclaves. So everything in blue. Little tiny areas of the Netherlands within Belgium, within the Netherlands. So hopefully that's not too confusing. When we get over into Kyrgyzstan, so Central Asia, we have Tajikistan up here, we have Uzbekistan over here, we have Kyrgyzstan here. And Kyrgyzstan has some enclaves. So we've got some Uzbeki enclaves here in the yellow. And we've got a Tajik enclave right here in the blue. Between India and Bangladesh, we also have quite a few exclaves and enclaves. So everything in green is an enclave of Bangladesh. Everything in orange is an enclave of India. And then this is the same concept. We just see it in slightly different colors. But we can see how much crossover there is. We have Bangladesh within India within Bangladesh. And remember, this is largely a result of partition. So that's separation of the countries. Okay. So I want you to take a moment and identify 4 of the different types of boundaries and state shapes. And remember that a whole bunch of those boundaries fall within cultural, including the one that we often consider a third one, and that's the geometric boundary, but it is part of a cultural boundary. So identify 4 of the types of boundaries and state shapes. Using 2 specific examples, explain how state shape can affect the country. So you want specific examples of states with certain shapes and talk about how it affects that country. All right, that is it for today. So go back and watch anything that you missed. Make sure you're reading in your textbook, taking good notes, and have a great day. Bye.